Part 2. The biggest difference in environmental exposures that happened during those 3 short years was the increase in their vaccines. Gay Tate, PhD, LSW, MLSP. What if it were true that the way we now vaccinate our children causes more death, chronic disease, and disability than it prevents in America? Judy Converse, MPH, RD, LD. I deeply regret my decision to allow Zeta to get this shot. She has lost all quality of life. I would do anything to get her better, but no one has any answers for me. The doctors still don't believe it was the vaccine. Amy Pingle. Unfortunately, these brave defenders of our freedom are defenseless against the mandatory use of dangerous vaccines, such as the anthrax vaccine. Captain Richard Rove, RN, BSN, B-C, USAF, retired. Chapter 11. 3 Short Years. By Gay Tate, PhD, LSW, MLSP. Not many things can compare to the heartache of helplessly watching your young child lose developmental skills and regress into a world of mental confusion and physical pain. This is something you would never wish on any parent. Sadly, I have had to face this challenge not once, but twice. My name is Gay Tate, and I am a mother, former scientist, and practicing psychotherapist. My husband, Alan, and I have 3 children, ages 21, 18, and 14. Our oldest was born in 1989 and was vaccinated according to the recommended schedule of the 1980s. He has always been strong and healthy. Our 2 younger children, born in 1992 and 1996, received their vaccinations according to a sharply expanded vaccination schedule, beginning at 12 hours old. It was the schedule typically followed for American children born in the 1990s. They have both been diagnosed with autism. They are not alone. This series of events and outcomes has repeated with thousands of other children and families, and autistic spectrum disorders have reached epidemic levels in this country. My family has experienced, firsthand and from the beginning, the unfolding of what I believe to be man-made catastrophe. In less than 2 decades, we have moved from needing to explain what autism is, since so few had ever seen a person with autism, to seeing autism studies offered as a major in college. This is our story. Young Alan, my firstborn, was almost 3 years old when I was expecting my second child. I had left a rather intense and demanding life as a research scientist to experience motherhood full-time. Alan was sweet, precociously verbal, and very excited to be getting a new brother or sister. My pregnancy was smooth and uneventful, and Kenny was born in June, big and healthy, the day before my 4th wedding anniversary. Life was hectic, but good. During his first year, Kenny hit his developmental milestones. He was good-natured, had a great appetite, and grew well. At his 4-month well visit, he had developed a wheeze following a cold. His doctor prescribed a wide-spectrum antibiotic and a nebulizer, and because he was running a fever, she agreed to postpone his 4-month round of vaccines for a week or 2. 10 days later, although he still had a wheeze, he was not running a fever, and we went ahead with his shots. With time and a couple more rounds of antibiotics, his wheeze eventually resolved and he continued to grow and progress. I remember that Kenny spoke 15 words at 15 months old, just like his big brother. However, I was concerned that he was not walking yet, and even seemed oddly fearful of cruising at times. When I reported this to his pediatrician, I was told not to worry. Big babies are lazy. He'd rather talk than walk, the intellectual type. The doctor was mildly concerned, however, because his head size had increased and veered off his growth curve slightly. Still, he gave Kenny his MMR vaccine. Just to be sure, off we went for a skull x-ray and ultrasound. Both were normal. No problem, but by 18 months I was aware of a significant change. Kenny had slowed down. He spoke less and tended to sit in one spot, often with his head tilted to one side as if it was too heavy. He still was not walking on his own. Again, the doctor tried to reassure me that boys are slower to develop and that we should give him until 20 months to walk on his own. In my gut, I knew something was very wrong, but the people around me dismissed and minimized my concerns. It was a lonely and dreadful feeling. Then Kenny's disposition, which always had been sunny and affectionate, began to take on a quality of misery. Kenny often seemed disconnected, hypersensitive, and fearful. He was obsessed with ceiling fans and lights, and started to wake up many nights either laughing uncontrollably or screaming in pain from diarrhea. By now, my husband was very concerned. At age 2.5, the pediatrician finally agreed that Kenny showed developmental delays in all areas and recommended a specialist's evaluation. I was desperate to know what this meant for his future, but doctors said it would take a couple of years before anyone could say for sure. We would just have to wait and see. In the meantime, Kenny qualified for early intervention services. I watched Kenny constantly, calculating his every move in terms of the developmental charts. It sometimes took conscious effort to pull my eyes off him to pay attention to Alan, which added more guilt to my emotional load. We were also now on the treadmill of endless speech, physical and occupational therapy sessions, usually with Kenny screaming, me sweating, and Alan trudging along with a toy and a book. As Kenny made progress in some areas, new behaviors emerged. For example, as his walking improved, he went up on his toes and flapped his hands. As we got some language back, he began to verbalize with endless loud E sounds. Moreover, he was obsessed with videos. Discontent to wait years for an answer, I did my own research and concluded that Kenny's behavior fit the criteria for autism. As surprising as it might sound in today's world, my doctors and therapists again minimized my concerns and tried to talk me out of it. Developmental delays, yes. Some sensory issues, maybe. But not autism. It was early 1995, and the wave of regressive autism that is so prevalent today was just beginning. It was not until Kenny was nearly 4 and I was pregnant with my third child that I was gently informed that Kenny was moderately to severely autistic, as though it would be a terrible shock. I was past shock, and it was certainly not news to me. I knew well before the professionals. I also could not get satisfactory answers about all the physical maladies afflicting Kenny. His nose was constantly stuffy. He had crust behind his ears and nearly non-stop diaper rash. When I asked about his eyes rolling back in his head, the doctor said that as long as Kenny could respond to my voice when it happened, it was not a seizure. Good, I think, but what was it? The diarrhea was the worst, though, foul and discolored. It was obviously so painful for him. He would burst into tears and the diarrhea would start, sometimes so often that his bottom would bleed. It was heart-wrenching to see, and it just didn't make sense. He had been fine, and was born healthy and beautiful. I was from a medical family with a strong background in science, and was not aware of any disorders with this timing and this particular array of symptoms. He just seemed so sick. I bounced for a while between anger and grief, distorted into a form of aggressive industry. My husband Alan and I found a program that favored dropping diagnostic labels and treating problems like Kenny's as a brain injury. We hired a caregiver, attended a week-long intensive training, and put together an extensive physical, behavioral, and academic program for Kenny. We tried a different diet, sound and smell therapies, set up a special gym, and looked at endless flashcards and photographs. My husband Alan, our caregiver, and I spent many hours doing creeping and crawling strengthening exercises with Kenny through the house. And we did patterning therapy most mornings with another family whose daughter had developmental delays. I can still remember young Alan demonstrating the patterning technique and coaxing the younger kids up onto the training table. It felt better for all of us to be doing something, and it did help. Kenny was getting stronger. In the middle of putting this all together, my daughter Olivia was born. She was a joy, bright and curious, and always engaged with people and activities around her. By now, Alan was 7, doing well in school and playing soccer. I was doing okay. When I started to feel sorry for myself and overwhelmed by Kenny's disabilities, I told myself that I could handle it. I tried not to think, why my child, but rather, why not? There are no guarantees. With intensive work, he would get better. I had struck a fragile balance and life went on. Olivia continued to flourish and was more active and social than even young Alan had been at her age. She was physically precocious and had easily hit all her developmental milestones by her 18-month checkup, when she was given the MMR vaccine. I can still remember the nurse practitioner's panic that Olivia, for some reason, had not been given the MMR at an earlier visit. At 2 years old, she knew colors and shapes and loved the alphabet. However, I noticed that a change was occurring. In stores, she began rubbing the rugs instead of focusing on shopping, and although she knew many words, she wasn't stringing them together. When I expressed my uneasiness, friends and family told me I was understandably a little paranoid after dealing with Kenny's development. After all, the pediatrician had never found any cause for concern at her well visits. I latched onto this and managed to stay in denial for a few more months. In late 1998, I was in New York City attending a conference on autism, hoping to gather the latest information for Kenny's program. Parent groups, along with a small but growing group of medical researchers, were mobilizing, trying to figure out what was happening to so many children. At the end of the day, I remember listening to a talk on a new developmental screening called a CHAT test, checklist for autism in toddlers. Apparently, a lack of forefinger pointing at objects in a young toddler's behavior was the single most telling sign in predicting autism. It hit me with such force. Olivia had stopped pointing. Within seconds, my denial disappeared, and I felt as if someone had pushed me into an empty elevator shaft. To this day, I can still remember the suddenness of the realization and physical shock that Olivia was regressing toward autism. I am not sure how I made it home to Pennsylvania. Over the next year, despite private speech therapy, my daughter's language slipped away and was replaced by occasional inappropriate words and phrases from Barney videos. Her behavior changed from outgoing and curious to fearful and rigid. She cried a lot, and her facial expressions took on a distant, even bewildered look. At 3.5, she was officially diagnosed with autism, and I was utterly heartbroken. I was no longer even superficially okay. I could not fathom how I would get through this again. For a while, I struggled with feeling depressed and overwhelmed. Everyone has a limit, and I had reached mine. Nevertheless, I tried to keep my game face on and keep moving forward with interventions for Olivia. At this point, we scaled back Kenny's home program because he had entered school full-time as one of 4 boys in the first autism support classroom in our district. We were still exhausted from the many nights Kenny would wake and stay up. From age 3 to almost 9, he slept on the couch in our den, often not more than 4 or 5 hours. In addition, our caregiver, only 19 when we hired her, had understandably moved on with a new career, and finding a reliable replacement had been challenging. It was a difficult period. Looking back, I realized that I was also incredibly sad. Grief after an autism diagnosis is difficult to process. For me, it felt like there was no time, as if the window of opportunity would close for turning things around if I relaxed or got lost in emotions. There was a sense that I was never finished, that I hadn't done enough or had missed something crucial. There was a lot of guilt. Eventually, though, things began to look up a bit. After a failed attempt at regular preschool, Olivia began attending a full-time autism support class. By this time, children with a PDD, pervasive developmental disorder, or autism diagnosis, were not so rare, and services had to adjust. I worried that a full-time preschool program would be too much for her, but she seemed to enjoy it, bus ride and all. Around the same time, we found a wonderful new caregiver. Young Alan had become quite involved with traveling soccer and basketball teams, guitar and dance lessons, and this gave his dad, coach, and me more time to support him and attend his games and performances together. Also, with the help of a good Defeat Autism Now, Dan, doctor, and developmental pediatrician, we were able to calm Kenny's raging intestines. Improving his intestinal health, along with a low dose of Risperdal, helped him finally sleep through the night and tolerate sleeping upstairs in his own room in a regular bed. Over the next few years, we chiseled away at Kenny and Olivia's physical symptoms and behaviors with various prescription medications, supplements, diets, and therapies. Nothing dramatic happened with either child, just slow, steady progress. Both children had developed some very basic functional language. Although still in pull-ups, Kenny's muscle tone had improved, and he seemed happier and more comfortable in his own skin. Olivia sometimes struggled with anxiety and obsessive-compulsive tendencies, but she loved the structure of school and asked to go every day. Our district had developed a good autism support program, and both kids had excellent, committed teachers and therapists. However, what seemed to be lacking there, and everywhere, was alarm. Recognition that something very wrong was happening and causing autism diagnoses to skyrocket. In one school district, in just 6 years, the need for autism support had ballooned from Kenny's original class of 4 boys to 7 full-time classrooms at the elementary school level. In 2005, after 16 years of being home full-time, I decided to venture out to go to graduate school, part-time, for a master's degree in clinical social work. Yes, it was still true that our family's needs and complexities were daunting, but I felt we had reached a comfortable equilibrium that could accommodate my new goals. However, although I finished my master's program, a challenge we could not have fully anticipated was the powerful impact of puberty on Kenny and Olivia. Again, this was uncharted territory with this new wave of sick children. During the first year of middle school, Kenny, usually sweet and cooperative, had some episodes of aggression with teachers and aides who were not familiar with his signals and behaviors. His school called Alan and me into several meetings with the rest of his team, and the situation was easily resolved. Then, at age 15, the day after Christmas, Kenny had a massive grand mal seizure. Alan was coming back from driving young Alan to the airport on his way to a basketball tournament, and I was home alone with Kenny and Olivia. I had taken Kenny to sit on the toilet when he started to seize. He was fully grown by then, and in the small bathroom there was no place to get him down to the floor without one of us being injured. I don't remember how I dialed 911, but I did. Inexplicably, they did not arrive for 15 minutes. In that time, his breathing stopped and started several times, and I had trouble finding a consistent pulse. When the paramedics finally arrived, they hustled me out of the house and began working on Kenny. I remember sobbing in our driveway while Olivia smoothed my hair and wiped tears off my cheeks. The ambulance transported Kenny to our local hospital, and then quickly airlifted him to Children's Hospital in Philadelphia. He was in intensive care in neurology for a week, and has been on seizure medication ever since. I believe that if this had happened during the night, or I had not been nearby, he would have died. Olivia began middle school and her menstrual period at about the same time, in the fall of 2008. Her anxiety and obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD symptoms, had already been escalating, and the erratic cycle of hormone activity put them over the top. The girl who had loved to go to school now had more and more days of either lashing out physically at teachers and aides, or curling up in a ball in the foyer of her classroom.